just give a second for the live stream to start.
Everybody can hear me. Quick thumbs up. Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Call the meeting to order. It is 1:01 on Thursday, June 8th. Can't believe it's June already. First thing, hopefully everybody has had a chance to take a look at the agenda. We've got a few items today. So if there are no changes or amendments, can I get an approver for the agenda? I see Janice, and then a second. I see Darcy, and then all in favor of approving this agenda. Perfect, thank you. Derek also sent out the minutes from the previous meeting that happened on May 4th. So again, if there are no edits, amendments, anything like that, I guess I could ask for that first. Not seeing anything, so an approver, thanks Susan, and then I see Emily as a seconder. So all in favor that the minutes held from May 4th be approved. Perfect. Thank you. Moving through the agenda, number 4, we are at the disclosure of pecuniary interest. As far as I'm aware, not seeing anyone that has any disclosure, so we will move on. This week we do have 2 different delegations. So our first delegations, and Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, I think delegations get 5 minutes and then directly following we have questions, or do they get longer?
Nope, that's right, Amy. Delegations are given 5 minutes and then question and answer with the committee. We do ask committee members to limit it to a maximum of 2 questions just in the interest of efficiencies.
Okay, perfect. So our first delegation is going to be Joseph Dowser, chair of the Kingston Area Taxi Commission. And they are going to speak on accessible taxi cab service in Kingston. So welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, I'd like to start the delegation by saying and wishing everyone a good afternoon and thank everyone for the opportunity to speak with you all today. As you may be already aware, my name is Joseph Dowser. I'm the chair of the Kingston Area Taxi Commission. And for those who may not know who we are, the Kingston Area Taxi Commission was enacted in 1989 through a motion of provincial parliament under Bill PR 24 and is the provincially legislated body that governs the licensing, regulation, and enforcement of taxi services, including accessible taxis, within the city of Kingston and Loyalist Township. The KATC's governance also extends to TNCs through our oversight of the city's TNC bylaw 2022-6. The KATC and industry have provided accessible transportation services for many years, enacting its bylaw number 3, a bylaw respecting accessible taxis, back in 2009. This bylaw provided further governance and regulation specific to accessible service while ensuring public safety and operating guidelines for complied with for accessible and vulnerable passengers. Additionally, the KATC established and instituted its own accessible committee in 2022, comprised of 3 commissioners, 1 industry, and 1 public members. The Accessible Committee hosts and convenes public meetings every 4th week of each month. Our Accessible Committee focuses solely on accessible taxis and services, the needs and or requirements of accessible passengers, and various other components that serve to provide a voice to those who have otherwise felt excluded. Furthermore, the Accessible Committee embodies a mandate of the KATC that we are committed to a barrier-free community, ensuring access for all transportation services. Currently, both the KATC and its Accessible Committee are working with the industry and public to provide increased access to accessible taxis and transportation services. This includes, but is not limited to, increasing the number of accessible taxi cabs available, the requirements of accessible taxi owners to provide detailed and regular reporting to the Commission, compliance with the bylaw through training, education, and enforcement, and the potential for subsidy programs that would serve the industry, accessible patrons, and communities. It is the KATC's goal that through transparency, communication, cooperation, and partnerships, that we can bring forth a more diverse and inclusive accessible taxi and transportation industry that operates professionally and exceeds the needs and requirements of our vulnerable accessible communities. We encourage everyone to participate where possible with the KATC and its committees, and all information on how an individual can do so is posted online via our website at katc.ca and social media. In the spirit of cooperation, it is our hope that both the KATC and the MAAC remain open to each other, and through transparent communication, our commitment to a barrier-free and access all for all community exceeds all regulatory, industry, and public expectations. I thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Joseph, for that great introduction and covering kind of a lot of the stuff that you have done. I will open the floor now to questions from committee members. If you want to either virtually raise your hand, or if you're on video, feel free to raise your hand and I can go from there if anyone has any questions. Kim, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dowser, for your presentation. I wonder if you could explain to me who handles or oversees the training of accessible taxi drivers?
That's an excellent question, and through you, Madam Chair. As of the late, it has always been the requirement of the accessible taxi owner, the plate holder per se, to provide the training and facilities to bring an accessible driver to the PAR that is set out in the ODA. The Commission is currently looking at expanding that training program, and through cooperation with the industry, to not only have certification requirements, but renewal requirements to ensure that each year, as you know, rules change, that each year certain individuals come up to the new knowledge of the programs that are in place. It's always good to keep the industry and persons who are operating these vehicles in a full compliance with the education levels, and it is our commitment to make sure that those issues are met.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Susan, I see.
Thank you. And thank you also for the presentation. I'm just picking up on what Kim asked in terms of training for accessible cab drivers. And maybe this is beyond the scope of what you do. I'm just curious because a lot of people with disabilities might also just take regular cabs. And in terms of education and training and increasing awareness in general, have there been any thoughts about expanding training and awareness as part of your mandate if it's relevant? Thanks.
Excellent, and thank you. That is a very valid question, and I should have responded with that in the original answer. We aren't just focusing on the accessible drivers training, we're also focusing on further training with our current industry members that drive regular or what we refer to as standard taxi cabs. This includes some sensitivity training, the ability to training and whatnot to help individuals in and out of a car, the requirements of the service industry. As we all know, the taxi industry is a service transportation industry. And what we want to do is make sure that the entire industry has some level of training to have sensitivity, motivation, etc. in training. But with accessible cabs, they'll be more focused towards the ODA requirements, such as the loading and unloading of accessible passengers, the requirements for secure and bondability, etc. And it's not just limited to accessible, but it will be expanded to the entire industry.
Lucy, I think you were next.
Thank you, and thank you for this presentation. I was curious about the number of accessible, or the proportion of accessible taxi cabs as opposed to the regular, less accessible taxis in your fleet.
Thank you, and through you again, Madam Chair. Currently, the KATC has 9 licensed plate holders that are capable of operating accessible taxi cabs. Mind you, in looking into the future, and our goal is to bring, of course, the Commission into the 22nd century, our goal is to exceed and expand upon that and any expectations of the public. So, for example, our goal and it's an unspoken goal right now, is that we hope that there will be approximately 25 to 30% of the fleet that offer accessible services, so that on any given day, night, anywhere, any place, a patron picks up the phone and asks for an accessible service. There's no wait time, there's no delay. An accessible cab is dispatched and that individual is served to their needs.
Dinah?
Okay, so availability, there seems to be a lot of non-availability of an accessible cab. And I live and speak in the community with a lot of different people with different needs. And some of the complaints or the issues that people come across that I hear about is, one, not being able to get a non-accessible or no one needing a ramp, but people that have a manual wheelchair that needs to be folded up and put in the trunk, but can't get a driver because dispatch says that, well, we don't have a driver right now that can lift your chair, therefore you're going to have to wait till we can get one. Or your walker, depending upon the mobility aid that the person needs. So that becomes an issue for them. So they end up waiting. Or they have a really small car or an electric car, so therefore it won't fit. So you have to hold on to that. And this is in the downtown area where you would think that there'd be a little more. The other thing with that is the ramped vehicles, the accessible vans. There's none on the road. So sorry, and they end up, say, being at a bar or wherever they are, so they can't get an accessible vehicle, so they have to find their own way home. So the other thing is, you have somebody that has dialysis or, you know, a medical appointment, not that that should matter whether it's a bar or a medical appointment, so they can't get where they need to go. So I'm wondering, what you're saying, Mr. Dowser, sounds wonderful, but in fact, it's not that wonderful. So I'm wondering what you can tell me in regards to these issues with the accessible, the taxi commission. Oh, sorry, there's one more thing, the service animals. There seems to be an issue there too, with a lot of them having allergies. And my understanding with the ODA is that it's not, the AODA is that service animals don't trump allergies in some settings. So they need to get another cab there if you're going to honor one over the other. Sorry, go ahead.
Excellent concerns. And of course, being that this commission is absolutely transparent, so please forgive me if this answer sounds very forward. You are absolutely correct. It is the number one concern that the commission has received since opening the doors to the public to receive complaints, that accessible taxis are not available to the individual. Forgive me. It doesn't matter whether the individual is at the bar, having a good time with friends, needs to go to dialysis. Any need of an accessible passenger should be met by the industry. The problem and complaints that we are receiving is that out of the 9 taxi cabs that are licensed, there are very limited that are operating. A common complaint that we hear from the industry is that there's insufficient accessible drivers, or those drivers no longer wish to operate the accessible because the financial feasibility isn't there for them. Whereas, you know, and I know it sounds horrible to say, a driver who operates an accessible cab could make $100 a night, whereas someone offering a regular cab service could make $500 a night. And it is the unfortunate side that the need for money or the need for income is superseding the necessity for accessible service. And that is a commitment that the KATC is working diligently on, to provide more accessible drivers to the industry, to bring their vehicles into code, to provide them with subsidies or programs or financial aid to bring more vehicles on the road. And it's a process. And unfortunately, as we know, it is the number one complaint. It is a slow process. So one of the aspects that I will bring to your attention is that the Accessible Committee has requested from all accessible owners their reportings, both their quarterly and yearly reportings for the previous 2 years, so that we can come to an understanding as to where the service is lacking. It's one thing to say or receive many complaints that say, oh, there's no service, there's no service. It's another thing to see a data point or a reason why there was no service. And once we have those, we can enact on them either through enforcement of the bylaw, education of the bylaw, or bringing on more financial aid to the system in order to produce more accessible cabs, more accessible drivers to service the needs of the community.
Okay, great. Thanks for that response. Does anybody else have any questions? I see, I'm not sure who is first. Let me see if it shows me in the list. Penny, it looks like.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I know that the city of Ottawa, it's important for our city to have good taxi services for people with disabilities, because it is the city of Ottawa that gets the reputation regardless of where the services are coming from, whether it's an accessible cab or not. And I don't have a physical issue. I'm just totally blind, and I notify taxi drivers, the regular drivers, I'm blind, and yet they don't come to me and help me to the cab. I don't know where the cab is specifically. I know the general direction, but I'm not going to go forward and try to find a door and feel all over the car. I mean, that's demeaning. And so little things like that, where they stay in the car and they're kind of watching you. And even my neighbor said, you know, I saw you waiting and saw the cabs in the taxi, and he's not getting out, and he's just waiting, and you're just waiting, and you're wondering, oh, how this is going to work. So she came running over. Now, that shouldn't have to happen. Just totally stupid. So it's the tourism of the city that happens, and it is a citywide problem because people talk about Kingston and the terrible drivers here in terms of most of the time for disabled people. And I think I know I would, and other people probably would too, is to be a part of that training so you get the real people in a situation. And so, you know, do it with a real person, really guide a real disabled person, so that nervous little bit, you get over it. That's probably would help too. Thank you.
If I can, through you, Madam Chair, if I can respond to that. First, I'm going to respond to this in a couple of parts. First, not as the chair of the Taxi Commission, but as an individual. And to hear a member of our community, whether being an accessible member of the community, a person with disabilities, or just in general, an individual that needs a taxi cab, to find out that an individual is not receiving the aid or the assistance from the taxi cab driver, who is in essence charging a fare to that individual, is appalling. And I, as chair, taking that role back now, apologize profusely if that has ever happened. We have open channels to the community and to the public, that they no longer need to just complain to the broker or bring the concern to the broker, which is i.e. Amy's Taxi, Modern Taxi, or any other brokerage house that will be operating in Kingston, but to bring it to the commission's attention. And by doing so, every case that comes in, every complaint, concern, suggestion comes in, is assigned a case number, and it is followed through diligently and meticulously. As part of that sensitivity training, we're also looking into service training. And coming from the industry, and also from, you know, the service industry, I've owned and operated many pizza shops in the years. Service is key. And so is the respect and dignity of the person you're serving. And again, I do profusely apologize that you have received that. And I encourage anyone and everyone who has a situation like that to record the plate the plate number, the time, the date, even the badge number where available, and report it to the commission for follow-up, and we will keep you in the loop. Again, it is a time matter. We are rolling out new programs, but it's just getting it out there, getting the people going, and getting people on board. Now, mind you, as a Mississaugian, I understand accessible service, and you pointed out that Ottawa has a great standard, which is 25%, which was mirrored off of Mississauga. Mississauga has a very strong accessible transportation service. I don't know, as of late, things have changed there, but I do, when I was a resident, long-term resident, it did have a fantastic service industry, which is where I'm drawing a lot of research and involvement from. Again, it's a time process. We will get there. As you were saying too, with regards to the drivers, we do have a vetting process now that not only just requires them to have their CPIC checks and their background checks, it also includes a comprehensive testing process, which is deals with the knowledge of bylaws, comprehension, common sense, accessible services, sensitivity training, and it's graded. If the member or an applicant fails that, they have one attempt to retest, but afterwards they have to go back to the application process and the vetting process once again. So we're hoping that through that process, we have, as we know, the city has declared this week being Taxi Operator Awareness Week, and that the taxi operators have been declared as ambassadors. We're hoping that the ambassador aspect of them shines through the ones that don't, if that makes sense.
Perfect, thanks. And Chantel?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I'm just looking up online some examples of accessible cabs. My mom was in a wheelchair. I've never seen an accessible cab before, but I'm from British Columbia. Things are different. So I'm just looking at this, and it looks like there's a ramp that goes into the middle of the vehicle, and then there's some seats behind it. So what I'm thinking, and it's a suggestion, and it may or may not be viable, but from a design and engineering perspective, in order to close the gap between the accessible drivers and the non-accessible drivers, that 100 versus 500 per night, it may, depending on manufacturing capabilities, it should be possible to design or have a cab designed, and this might be like an industry thing, not just Kingston, have a cab designed where seats can pop up where the ramp is when it's not in use, or where seats can be like clicked in. And I would tend to think from an engineering and design perspective that where there's a will, there's a way. I don't know if this would be a Kingston, but maybe you could be like the center of excellence in accessible taxi services, and other people could follow the Kingston model, that sort of thing.
And excellent. And through you again, Madam Chair, you're absolutely right. The picture that you're looking at is a ramp, one that comes off the side. What most of the accessible taxis actually use, either a ramp system or a lift system from the back of the taxi, which allows for the seating to still be there, and the whatever device is being used, whether it be a mobility chair, a wheelchair, or whatever, a service animal per se, that is reserved to the back. What happens there is that, for example, if an accessible call is taken place, and that person is picked up, dropped off, of course, assisted in both aspects during loading and unloading. What happens there is that when they have no passengers, that they're supposed to be put into the rotation of the next available regular call, per se. So that should offset the difference between the lower revenue to the higher revenue and balance it out. The problem is that it's not a problem. It's the priority service from an accessible vehicle is always to an accessible call. And since there is so few accessible taxis, those drivers aren't being able to capitalize or utilize that hybrid model, whereas after they drop off their accessible passenger, they become first in the zone to pick up a regular passenger. because as soon as they drop off, they have another accessible call, and they have to basically, and one of the biggest complaints of the industry right now is that they'll go from KGH to Spears Road or Manitou and Loyalist and have to come all the way back to KGH to then go to, you know, the north end of town, to come all the way back down to KGH, to go all the way back out to Manitou Road, to come all the way back. So you can see their concerns with that because they have a lot of dead time. But by increasing the number of vehicles on the road, that hybrid model can come into fruition. And then, of course, more drivers will say, well, hey, for a moment, I can actually work this. This is feasible for me. And more plate holders would say, yeah, there is cost added to operating an accessible cab, but the losses or the gains are equal to proportionate to that of a regular cab. And that's what we're working on. And again, I do apologize, but time is where things move. And as much as we can push things through, there's a period of learning, a period of aptitude, and a period of getting on board that is, of course, in everyday life needs to be done.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions, comments? Not seeing any. So thank you so much again for your presentation. I think you've gotten lots of comments from our committee that you can hopefully kind of take into consideration for things moving forward. And yeah, we appreciate your time today.
If I can interject, Madam Chair, as a chair as well, I just wanted to point out as well, I did not mention this. Again, it might be easier just to tell you a good way to contact the commission. Of course, we are now open 9 to 5, not this old fashioned 9 to 1, which has been the public's opinion of the commission for many, many moons. But we do have a specific email address that anyone with an accessible concern can use. I would be more than happy to provide it for you here. It's access@katc.ca. That email is monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sometimes you might not get the response right away because some things need to be done, but it is monitored. It is replied to, and all incoming communication is documented and investigated and meticulously put to order. And again, thank you for your time for presenting to you. I hope we have an opportunity to build something fantastic for Kingston. I would love to see us have no concerns coming into the future, but as we know, it is a public body and that does happen. But let's go into the 22nd century and bring access to all in a manner that works for everybody.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so moving along in our agenda, we're now on our second delegation. And as far as I can tell, there is also a report attached to that. Business item 7B, I believe, is also with this. Again, it is just a report for information though too. So I will start and I will let Michael Judd, who is going to present on parking fees and fine options that we've got.
Amy, sorry,
Yes,
if I may, I'll just make one clarification. So this is a presentation from Michael, who is a resident. He's just speaking to the report, but then we will also, he's speaking as a member of the public, but we'll also have a staff briefing on that coming up with the report.
On the report, in the report section?
In the report section,
okay,
yes.
Sorry.
No, we don't get that happening here very often. So
okay.
We'll give the floor back to Michael.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you to the city for the invite. I'm just going to go over this presentation briefly. A version of this was just presented hours ago by Ted Shute in legislature and will soon be presented in the House of Commons by our Member of Parliament. But Kingston should really lead the way, and this is something that we can do quickly. Whereas legislature and parliament take quite a while to process. So anyways, if making parking more accessible in Kingston. Next slide, please. At present, we have federal and provincial continuity in most matters concerning rights and accessibility. not addressed uniformly is one very important area of accessibility, that being the cost and effort of parking for the disabled and mobility challenged, of which I was one a number of years ago for quite some time. This very much comes into play when those with mobility challenges travel to new areas, cities, and provinces. It's even harder for those traveling here from other countries that have addressed this challenge long ago. In fact, many cities and entire countries have recognized and prioritized this quite a long time. We're talking decades. Next slide. Many cities in Ontario and Canada do allow free parking for APP holders. Most for at least 2 to 3 hours, but for many, the time is actually unlimited because it takes more time for somebody that has a challenge. Most allow it in municipal lots or street parking space. Many allow it in many more locations, including some designated no parking, not just in accessibility marked spaces, because those aren't spaced out necessarily where they're needed. This is done as the time, effort, and expense faced by those with disabilities can be significant. Some have to unload by ramp or lift, go pay, return, reload and display, then unload again to go about their day. Something that somebody without disabilities does not have to face. Others are expected to pole vault over plow drifts, of which we have lots in Kingston, with their crutches, or throw a walker back and forth over, to do what most take for granted. Next, please. And this speaks to a question that a council committee member spoke of earlier about the configuration of a van. Here's one configuration of a wheelchair accessible van. There are others, of course. Next slide, please. Now, all these cities that I've listed here, Toronto, Mississauga, Burlington, Niagara Falls, Sault Ste. Marie, that's just a small group of cities that have already done this, and they've done it for decades. There's also a large list of countries. In fact, the majority of countries have dealt with it for decades. Almost the entire EU, Great Britain, Norway, even little countries like Liechtenstein and Iceland and Argentina and so on, they've all dealt with this. And it's a big advantage to their communities, their business, the accessibility, the enjoyment of life for their citizens. However, glaringly absent to any of these lists is Kingston, the first capital city of this country. There are a few others, of course. In Canada, when I looked over it, it was about 60% do allow it, about 40 don't. Something like that. I did a lot of research, countries around the world, made a lot of phone calls, how they come up with their data, their costing, and things like that. I can answer questions in regards to that. I believe the city's done some base analysis. So yes, people with wheelchairs can indeed drive. People with disabilities can drive. If they can't, they need assistance from family and friends and so on. And this would be of great assistance to them. Caregivers and families need assistance when they're called upon to help transport with little effort and a very high return on investment. We can assist them. We can make life easier. Many in this city and Ted Chu, as I mentioned, support this initiative. And when I did the paperwork, our mayor, the mayor of Belleville, many other mayors and councillors and so on, signed a petition in this regard. Very happily. I was very glad for that support. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. A good deal of Ontario, Canada, and the world have worked out the value of making the planet more accessible by offering free parking for those with disabilities. I believe we should too. And so would you please join me in this initiative to help people have their lives a little more accessible. As I said, I did research this quite extensively through other countries and my own experiences from the States and Canada and various provinces and territories. The petition that was presented today by Ted Chu covered residents' hard copy signatures, from many provinces and territories. That's going through to, sorry, that petition, provinces and territories, that's being presented by Mark Gerritsen. I've got, I believe, over 3,000 signatures, and I think 3 no's. But yeah, so it's been very, very positive, and I hope that the city and this committee can ask the city to support it and lead the way. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and if anybody has any questions, especially about the cost, I'd be happy to answer them.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Michael. Anybody have any questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand, and I see Lucy, your hand is up.
Hi, thank you, Michael, for this presentation, and I 100% support this. I've been in Kingston for only 2 years, and I have always refused to pay for parking here. So you might have seen my name, or somebody has seen my name many times when I protest. I just tell people my best argument is you asking me to pay for parking is like me asking a fully able person to pay $2 an hour for using their legs. You know, so it's a ridiculous thing to do. Do you know if what you're asking for Kingston, is it for free parking with a limited time, or is it for a, you know, no limits, no time limit? I hope it is, but do you know which one it is?
I personally would like for it to be no limits. The city has, I believe the council has asked it for limited time parking. Put it forth to this committee, limited time parking at only accessible places. Very few cities have taken that path in the province, in the country, or other places around the world. But that was the ask of the committee. That is not what I of course would be seeking, because we have very few spaces and the cost is very low. The fill rate is extremely low on those spaces. So when they do a calculation of cost, they're doing a calculation, as far as I know, and hopefully the next people to speak can speak to that, was based on pay and display. So all they can do is, if 1% of the spaces are for disabled, they say, well, it's 1% of the income. So that is the cost. But the fill rate is actually low because they're not spaced out in the manner that is necessarily needed by people with disabilities. So they have to park in a regular space, right? So that's why most cities and countries that have done this have allowed it anywhere, and they've not put time limits. Some have, quite a few have, but they don't put the time limits because the getting in and out gobbles up so much time, especially for those individuals that are, say, a paraplegic or a quadriplegic with a chair having to unload and reload and so on, with a chair and a ramp system, or even a worse, a lift system out of a back gate. Takes up so much time. If they've got a 2-hour limit and they've gobbled up 40 minutes loading and unloading, that's an accessibility challenge to life for those individuals, and it cuts down on their enjoyment. Just the every day-to-day stuff that somebody that doesn't have those challenges has to face, and the cost. A disability equipped van is a tremendous amount of money, and the maintenance on that equipment is huge, and we have it within us to make it better. And by the way, it's good for business too. When people with a challenge go shopping, they buy stuff. They're not buying it on Amazon. If they can get back downtown, they want to get out. They want to be part of the community. I trust all of you do. I know what, I couldn't cross the street to save my life without a pair of crutches for a number of years. And it was very, very, very challenging, but I still wanted to be part of the community. And so if we can pull them out of shopping from Amazon from China to shopping in our downtown core again, that's a big advantage to our community, save aside giving people their lives back. They're spending money. So sorry for the long-winded answer.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for Michael? No, okay, thanks so much again, Michael, for joining us. And again, as Derek had mentioned, a little bit later in the agenda, we will have a report from the city in terms of their report, which was included in your agenda. So we'll get back to that after. So thank you again, Michael, for the information.
Thank you so much.
So the next item on our agenda then is our one and only briefing. And so we have Spiros Kanelos here, Director of Facilities Management and Construction Services, who is going to speak on facilities management and construction services updates. So Spiros, it is all yours.
Okay. Good afternoon. Through the chairperson, I'd like to thank the chairperson and all members of the MAC committee for giving us this opportunity to present to you today. With me, of course, I'm Spiros Kanelos, and I'm the Director of Facilities Management and Construction Services. And with me today is Jeff Rempel. He's our Manager of Facilities Construction Services. Next slide, please. In this presentation today, we'll briefly talk about some construction highlights over the last 2 years. We'll mention some of our ongoing construction projects. We'll talk about some of our up and coming projects, some staff training, and any questions or comments the committee might have at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. Some of the construction highlights over the last 2 years has been, the first one is at City Hall. We've done some significant fire protection upgrades to the city, to City Hall. That includes a whole new fire alarm system, sprinkler system installed throughout the whole building. We've done the restoration of 2 of the 3 front exterior stairs to this to City Hall. The Market Street ramp, which is one of the main accessible points into City Hall, has been renovated. It had a lot of concrete restoration work that was done on it, and that's been completed. And during this period, we also finished the interior wayfinding signage, some upgrades and changes. At the Grand Theater, we also finished renovations which addressed new flooring, especially in the washrooms, and we ensured that the contrast between the floor and the walls and the baseboard met FADs. We also increased the lighting levels and a variety of other renovations, aesthetic changes that we did there. And also the Richardson Beach House that I'll talk about in some more detail in a minute had some significant accessibility upgrades done to it. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned, we've been doing a lot of fire protection upgrades at City Hall. The work that we started in 2022 will continue and is proceeding into this year. The last phases of the project that we're working on now is the audible and visible signaling devices, and all this work will be done by August of this year. The Market Street ramp had all the structural repairs done to it, and those have been complete. But in the picture here, you'll see we installed the temporary ramp at the back door of the market wing, and we've decided to leave that ramp in place for the next 1 to 2 years until possibly a permanent ramp will be installed there. I see a hand that was raised.
Yes, Spiros, we will handle questions at the end of your briefing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Next slide, please, Derek. We moved the sleeping cabins from their winter location to their summer location at Center 70. And once again, we made 4 of the 17 cabins accessible. And in the fall, when they move back to the Portsmouth Olympic Harbor for their winter location, we will be making those 4 ramps again accessible at the winter location. Next slide, please. We mentioned the Richardson Beach House, that we did some significant renovations there, and the big focus was to make the facility accessible and to meet fads. And aside, there's the Richardson Beach House is opening this Saturday at 10 o'clock to the public. Some of the work that we did in the beach house was the power door operators were installed. A universal washroom with an adult change table was installed. We widened the corridors. We made the change rooms and washrooms there accessible. We included contrasting finishes on the floors, walls, and doors. Next slide, please. We're also in the process now of installing new transit bus shelters. The image below is difficult to see, but there's 3 sections. What you're seeing in the image below is if you include all 3 modules or all 3 sections, but the new transit bus shelters will have will meet turning radiuses within the shelter. There'll be vision strips on the glass and edges. There'll be tactile warning surfaces incorporated into them. There's bariatric seating, and there'll be enhanced lighting. Next slide, please. Some of the upcoming projects that are happening at City Hall. There's some wayfinding signage enhancements that are going to happen. We're changing some washroom signage throughout to address our equity, diversity, and inclusivity by including all gender restroom signage. So the 2 signs that you kind of see, it's very difficult to see on your on the left-hand side of the signs diagram, are the new signs that we're installing. They will all meet fads, as all the previous signs that we installed. And then there's also an exterior wayfinding signage that MAC has approved that is being installed in the summer on the exterior of City Hall on how to find our accessible entrances to get into City Hall. Next slide, please. Other upcoming projects. We've been working for a while with the Heritage Committee on introducing grassable handrails to be installed along the existing wood banister of the main staircase at City Hall. Right now, when you go up the main staircases, there's 2, one on the left and one on the right of the reception desk. There's a hand railing along the outer wall, but where the large, thick heritage handrail is, we're installing an additional hand railing to the side of it to make it more accessible. Also, we're doing a restoration project of the Frontenac County Courthouse, of the portico, but also the Kirkpatrick Fountain. And part of the restoration work of the Kirkpatrick Fountain, we're widening the sidewalks around it. Right now, it would be difficult with somebody with a mobility device to maneuver around the fountain, where part of the renovation work that we're doing is it will widen the sidewalks. And we're also starting the design work for our fire stations. Typically, they didn't comply with FADs in the past based on the nature of the users being firefighters. But in these 2 projects, if there's any plan to have any public use within these facilities, we're going to ensure that FADs are incorporated into those areas of these new facilities. Next slide, please. Staff training, we just want to highlight that we're continually doing departmental training as required, and as specific training is identified by our team, various members of our team continue with that training. Next slide, please. And Jeff and I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Spiros, for all the updates and all of the projects that you're working on. I know quite a few MAC members are likely involved in some of those projects, which are great. They're kind of moving along. We will now take questions for Spiros and his team. And Chantel, you have a question?
Hi, I just wanted to let you know that when I was behind City Hall a few weeks ago, I don't remember exactly when, there's a bench that is like when you're looking at City Hall, it's to the right. Like when you're standing at the back of City Hall looking at it, the bench is on the right and it's movable. And someone, don't know who, had, for whatever reason, moved the bench so that it was like partially blocking the ramp. And the thing is it wasn't like blocking it completely. So I was like, is the bench supposed to be there? But I was like, I don't know. So I went over and like, see if it moved, and it did. And I put it back where it normally would be. So it might be an idea to take some like, bolts and bolt that bench down.
Thank you very much for that observation. I'll reach out to our Karen Santucci, our Director of Public Works, and bring that to her attention after this meeting.
Anybody else? I see, let me go to my list. Who was first? Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I did try to go to City Hall once to complain about a parking ticket. And I could not find the accessible entrance. It was my very first time there. And I couldn't see any signage. So I'm glad that you have some signage. I hope it's really big and clear at the entrance, at the main entrance, before you have to go up the stairs, because I couldn't find anything then. Also, when I did go up the stairs ultimately and hurt my shoulder, I asked the person beyond the at the desk where the accessible entrance was, and was told that it's at the back. Oh, it's at the back. And I felt a little bit like it's like we hide people with disabilities. We let them enter through the back of the building. So just having also a little bit of training on how people can respond to questions related to disabilities might be a good thing to do, just so that, people can say it's to the right of the building, or, it's over there, or something that is a little bit less, insulting might be a good thing. Just a little notice.
Thank you.
And Kim.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was one of the MAC members who consulted with Dan Korneluk on the new fire protection features, and I was quite impressed with what you've done. Good improvements there. I do have one concern though, because as a wheelchair user, once you're inside City Hall, in an emergency situation where the hallway is smoke filled and such, it's not, especially in the basement when the fire doors close, it's not clear which exit I should go towards as a wheelchair user. So that was one of my concerns, because the building has multiple exits, but they're not all wheelchair accessible. So I'm hoping that inside the building, you'll be improving the signage, possibly using blue light emergency bells to give us something visually and concretely that can say in an emergency situation, person in a wheelchair or scooter or walker, go towards this exit once you're inside the building. Because in an emergency situation, you don't want to be wandering from one exit to the other, trying to figure out which one is the best one to go towards. Thank you.
Thank you. I will bring this up with Dan, and we'll investigate this and If the committee would like, we'd get back to them. And we'd also make sure that it's included in our fire safety plan for the facility and tied into all our processes and procedures. So we will definitely follow up on this. Jeff?
And
sorry.
if I may also say, Dan was wonderful. I was quite impressed.
Thank you.
I know my microphone's on, but I'm not sure I'm able to turn on my camera. Oh, there we go. Oh, excellent. Just to add to Spiros's comments, so the system itself is designed to be fully in compliance with all required codes. So there is not a specific door that you need to go through if you have accessibility issues. You're allowed to go through every door. And outside of every exit, there will be an area of refuge. So we'll make sure that that is really clarified in the fire safety plan. But in the event that an alarm is pulled in any building, everybody is allowed to use whatever the nearest exit is to get outside the building. And there has to be adequate refuge and adequate signage and adequate lighting to get you there. So we'll ensure that that's documented. We can show you that in the fire safety plan.
Kim, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, if I may, as the wheelchair user, I can't use the nearest exit because many of the exits at City Hall were not actually accessible.
So there'll have to be an area of refuge that you would go to that exit. And then in the fire safety plan, someone be responsible to make sure that those areas of refuge are monitored and addressed. And that's in the fire safety plan.
Great, thanks for that follow-up, Jeff. Any other questions from our committee members? And I can't recall if I mentioned at the beginning, but their report was also attached as 7A business item. So hopefully, also if you have questions on that report, if for some reason they weren't addressed, you're welcome to address them at this point as well. Seeing no questions. Okay. Thanks so much, both Jeff and Spiros, for your comments.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity to present to your committee. Thank you.
So our next is again business item 7A was just the report for information from Spiros and his team. Derek, I don't recall. I don't think we have to approve anything, so it was for information only.
That's correct.
Okay. So moving on to 7 item B is our accessible parking fees and fine options that again are coming for information purposes only. So there is no motion on the table for us to approve or anything like that. But we are we will listen from Curtis, is that right? And then we can ask some questions after. So Curtis, the floor is over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and through you, pleased to be speaking with you this afternoon. My name is Curtis Smith. I am the Director of Licensing and Enforcement for the City of Kingston. And under that portfolio falls all of the various enforcement jobs in the City of Kingston. So bylaw enforcement, property standards, parking enforcement. And as a kind of a second part of the portfolio, the other half of it, and today I have my manager of licensing, parking operations, and policy with me, is that we run and maintain all of the parking spaces, municipally owned parking spaces in town. So the garages, the surface lots, and the on-street parking. So Laird is my manager of that, and he'll be able to jump in with details that I may not necessarily know about. So the purpose of our report today, it's in response to the motion that was made in March through City Council to examine the possibility of providing free, accessible parking, time limited in a certain manner to the residents of the City of Kingston. And also there's a second prong to that with the potential for us to be raising the fine for improperly parking in an accessible space. They're separate issues, but they're actually a little bit complementary. As you see, they got tied together perhaps, or you may have read in the report that they are tied together. So let me make a few comments on the report, and then we'd be happy to address any questions that you have. First off, there's a lot of numbers in the report. I will acknowledge that. parking in the city of Kingston, this is maybe somewhat different than some of the other cities in Ontario and Canada in particular. We run that as effectively, I'll call it a separate business. It's almost like a crown corporation. So all of the money that we take in for parking through fines and fees and permits and all that stuff, that is only spent on parking infrastructure, maintaining the parking infrastructure. We don't get any funding from the city of Kingston proper through property taxes or the tax roll to operate parking. The intention is that parking pays for itself. And as a result of that, generally the thought has been that the users of those parking spaces should be paying for that. Now, recognizing there's all sorts of exceptions and reasons and social reasons and good reasons to be able to do that, that is the way that we have approached this traditionally. Parking fees in Kingston, we do our very best for the most part. We do have a reduced fee for the accessible spots, and we do operate that the best we can. In some spaces we can't, just because of the nature of the pay and display machines and things like that. But for the most part, we're about 50 cents an hour less for an accessible parking space. And that's generally in the high traffic areas. I'm specifically thinking maybe in the hospital area, in the downtown area. And we do try to provide as close or as accessible a parking payment option as we do. So you'll note really the few places left in the city of Kingston with the old school parking meters with the coins that you put in and things like that, they're generally placed right beside an accessible parking spot to allow, for relatively easy access. Our Honk mobile app was rolled out to accessible spots. That was the first group of parking spaces in the city of Kingston that got that, to allow you to potentially pay for your parking space over a mobile phone, so that there's absolutely no requirement to be going back and forth or to a pay and display meter. And in very general terms in our planning, we try to get the pay and display meters as close as we feasibly can to an accessible parking space, understanding that we do have to serve generally, a couple 100 meters or 100 meters worth of parking spaces. Anyway, those are just some of the thoughts there. The idea in this overall in the city is that we have user pay for those parking spaces, and we have adopted a reduced fee for accessible parking spaces over the last number of years. This report brings forward a couple of options that was feasible. And please understand that I'm approaching this from a budgetary perspective, and that I'm trying to balance the budget and make sure that I've got the funds available to keep operations going. But respecting council direction, and we're coming to you today for some more consult on this. So let me go with one of the easier ones, because I think there's probably going to be agreement around the table on it, although I could be wrong, and that would be the raising of the fines for improperly parking in an accessible parking space. You may have read in the report that we did a survey around Ontario. Back in 2005, I believe the province mandated a minimum fine of $300 for improperly parking in an accessible parking space. So that's for someone without the accessible placard. And we've adopted that since 2005. The report outlines a number of municipalities that have gone above and beyond that. We're bringing this forward to you today, and we're actually contemplating this well before the motion anyway, to raise that. We would like to raise the fine in order to produce more of a deterrent effect to stop people from parking in these spots improperly. I understand a number of years ago, this committee actually had a bit of a program going, and it was called Laziness is Not a Disability. And that was really to bring some awareness to the fact that don't park in these spots. It may be empty for periods of time in the day, but when it's needed by the members of the public who have accessibility issues. So I would like one of the thoughts that we're bringing forward is to raise that fine. I believe it was outlined in the report to $400 as opposed to $300. That's somewhere in the middle of where we've seen the fines tend to max out around $450 in some of the municipalities. So we would like that thought mostly for a deterrent effect, but as you may have read in the report itself, that could tie in potentially to fee reductions for the accessible parking in and of itself. It'll just kind of balance out the revenue and the expenses that we have. So that's for your consideration. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that when we open it up to questions. The second piece, and this is obviously going to be the more contentious piece, is the whole concept of the fees charged for accessible parking. So like I said earlier on, we operate under the general thought here that users should pay something towards their use of the parking spaces in the city of Kingston, both accessible and non-accessible. We've produced a couple of options in this report, i.e. the status quo, maintain it where it is, reduce it further to a flat rate of around the city of $1 an hour. And then the third option is to actually go with no fees whatsoever. Now, I will say there are some constraints in this. We discussed it with, pardon me, the counselors in the development of this, because there's a lot of variables that can be involved here. So we did limit this, and this report is limited to existing accessible spots. So it's the number that we currently supply. We're not looking in this current report at opening up like no fee accessible parking across the city in any spot whatsoever. Hopefully I'm being clear on that. This is meant to reflect the 110 spots that are identified being on street and in our surface parking lots. So that was a constraint. We discussed that with council. It may not have come out in the motion specifically, but that's where we came from this. It doesn't mean that it's not a possibility to go further, as was indicated by the delegation that some of the other cities have done. But this report was really premised on limiting our views or our thoughts at this time to the 110 on-street and surface parking spots that we've got. We believe we can make it work with a reduction. And I'm coming at that from a purely accountancy, balance sheet perspective, pure numbers perspective. I'm not taking the social good or anything like that into account here. And please bear with me. I do take that into account, but I do have the fiduciary responsibilities here to make sure that we can keep parking operating. We believe that if we get approval through council to reduce the rate to $1 an hour around the city and to raise the fines for improperly parking in these accessible spaces, those will balance out and our expenses and revenue will balance out. We're effectively doing a cost recovery on it, and we can make that work. So that was one of the thoughts that we had there. We can also make the status quo work because we've been making the status quo work for 15, 18 years now. So that is also a possibility. Can we make a no fee accessible parking time limited in the current spots that we have work? We certainly could. I would want council direction on that because that is going to have an impact on my finances from relation of maintaining parking infrastructure within the city of Kingston. And as any person who's lived in Kingston for any length of time knows, parking is a valuable commodity. We're constantly dealing with it. We got a lot of development in the downtown area. We're losing parking lots. We're trying to make up for it. It's a consistent issue for us to try to provide parking to our healthcare workers in and around our various hospital campuses and things like that. And that's something else that we're working on with my team. So those are kind of the options that we have out there right now. I'm coming here for your consult because this committee represents the constituency that is going to be most affected by this right now. I'm happy to hear any points you may have, and Laird and I will answer any particular questions that you may have. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Curtis, for that. And again, the report was presented in the agenda, so hopefully you've had a chance to kind of look in detail at those options. At this point in time, there are the 3 options, again, that Curtis mentioned. And then I will take questions and comments from the committee at this point in time. So first up, I have Lucy.
Hi, thank you for your report. This is very interesting and does not make me super happy, as you can imagine. I'm wondering, as I'm looking at the list of other cities, for example, Toronto, who it does not say in your report, but not only gives free parking unlimited everywhere, but also to no parking zones where nobody else can. And that's a lot of different zones. So I'm wondering how they manage it, financially speaking, since that's a big issue for you.
And through you, Chair, I have no idea. So Toronto does operate the Toronto Parking Authority. So they have it's like a very set up kind of business structure. I'm going to be making an assumption here in that the sheer volume parking spaces and parking business that the city of Toronto has. They're able to absorb the costs around free accessible parking in various other ways through various other line items. I think it's just a sheer volume issue that they're able to do that. Other than that, I can't speak to exactly what business thoughts or accounting thoughts or anything like that came into play in Toronto.
It would be interesting to know what even smaller municipalities would do and how they manage it.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Next, Susan.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. Just to follow up on what Lucy said, though, I do have another question. I guess one of the issues would be proportionality as well. Toronto has more spaces, but we're only talking about 110 accessible spaces, I think you said. And so I also wonder how they account for that proportionality. And when you're making these recommendations, is there a way to take some of the lessons from other cities into account? But that's actually not my question. I have the other thing I wonder, though, is also what Lucy raised. Is there any consideration about allowing people with accessible parking placards to use no parking zones? Because I also lived in Toronto and that was invaluable. And I would guess from a revenue perspective, it wouldn't make any difference. So I guess I'm wondering the extent to which that's been considered. Also, relative to your point that downtown Kingston, which is near where I live, is very, very difficult to find parking or accessible parking. My last comment is that obviously cost is a factor. And so reducing the fees does help people for whom cost is an issue. But for me personally, it's the accessibility that's an issue. It's not so much whether I have to pay $1 or $2 in my personal case. It's how do I get to the parking machine? I only have use of one hand. It's extremely difficult for me to interact with the machines. And I guess what I'm wondering is if you decide to reduce the fees, is there any attempt when fees are still being charged to ensure that for every one of those 110 places, there's an accessible option for payment? Like I've used the phone option, which is great for me personally. But again, you know, if you're looking at time, it takes me a lot longer to do that than it does for somebody that has full use of both hands. So again, I'm already eating into the time that I'm paying for. And I wonder, and I don't know if this has been done in other cities, if there would be an option for those who use these kinds of spaces to just pay a flat fee a year and have a token or something or a ticket in their car. And so you say you have options of how much parking space you want to buy. And then the interaction with the actual physical environment becomes accessible for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. And through the chair, great questions. Thank you for bringing all those up. I'll deal with the no parking zones one first. We haven't had a look at that yet. That's a great question. I lived in Toronto myself for 8 years with a spouse who makes use of an accessibility placard. We understand the value of having that. That is something we can explore. So that wasn't through the nature of this report, but that is something that I can take back to my team and have a look at. So certainly that can happen. Let me speak to about your concern or the questions you raise about the accessibility of the actual payment mechanisms themselves. One thing that we are exploring is upgrading or making available single space payment options at every accessible space that we've got. So parking technology is getting a little bit crazy. So what we can do is, and Laird maybe can comment on this if I get it wrong, we can actually put in effectively, it's almost like a pay and display meter kind of at each accessible space. So it's like a pole, and you can touch with your credit card or with your debit card or whatever, and it will register, and it's only for that particular space. So not only will you have the coin option, which you have at a lot of the accessible spaces in town, but you'll actually have a digital option where you can do a quick and dirty pay and display, and honk as well, if that works for you. Understanding people have different abilities and things that they're able to make use of. So there is that. Let me just say one other thing, and it is about where the accessible spots are. And I know that was a concern that was raised, and it's kind of building on some of the things that you have mentioned. If you have a concern about where spots are, please let us know. If you think that more spots are required, please let us know. Come through the Contact Us portal that we have with the City of Kingston, and we are more than happy to take them under consideration and move them. I can say that we're actually adding an additional accessible parking space as of, well, hopefully as long as council approves it, at our next meeting on June 20th. So we're going to be putting in a new accessible space somewhere around Princess and Tower Street. So that's where the Medical Arts building is. And I believe that's where the CNIB has one of their locations. So we're actually adding, and that was on the basis of customer demand, resident demand. So we will definitely take that into consideration. Not necessarily what you were speaking of, but that is an option, and we listen. We do our best to try to provide these things. And we're happy to work with you on if there are better positioning of accessible places in downtown Kingston or in around the hospital or cancer center. I understand is another big spot where we have a number of accessible spaces. Please talk to us. Let us know. Your constituency, both this committee and the people that you represent, you know what's needed on the ground more so than I ever would.
Great, thanks so much, Curtis. And Penny, I have you up next.
So it bothers me tremendously that the only way parking's paid for when it's reduced for disabled people is to have the bad people paying the fines. When we're trying to reduce that, and if we were to really reduce it, you would have less of a budget, and therefore costs would go up even more. So there's got to be a way that the city contributes to these paid parking, because right now the only option for this to work is to have a number of people misbehaving and being charged for it. That's not the way I want my services paid for. It's not acceptable.
Thank you. I'll respond to that. Completely agree. Completely agree. I would be the happiest director of licensing and enforcement in the world if I ultimately didn't have to write another improper use of an accessible spot parking ticket or have my staff do it. They don't let me do it. So yeah, I would be thrilled if that would happen. And that is a reality. And we have to kind of work that into our calculations a little bit, that if we do have a successful deterrent effect by raising the parking fines, that ultimately it means that we aren't going to be balancing the books, for lack of a better word. I'm prepared to accept that. I think City Council is prepared to accept that. We're gonna have to explore, though, you are quite right, whether there is some other options here for funding this to try to make sure that the books get balanced, that I'm able to operate, my parking, keep up my parking infrastructure, provide parking to all of the residents of City of Kingston as it is required. So that is something that we're going to have to explore a little bit. And once I go through committee and council, we'll probably start getting into that a little bit more. Thank you for your comments, though. That's much appreciated, and it's astute. That's that is exactly one of the concerns that I had about trying to make this work.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Curtis? Nicholas?
Yep. Good afternoon, Curtis Thank you for coming on board here to give us some important information related to, I guess, your parking program and the enforcement done. Really appreciate that. I just wanted to bring forward a couple things actually based on the information you've provided. First of all, I work at the Leon Center right downtown. So I guess that's one tragically hip way. Right. On King Street, so the adjacent street there, that row of accessible spots, I know recently City Council has taken the fantastic step of removing the meters that were there that used to be required. I can tell you, and I hope that anyone else that works downtown may be able to chime in on this, is all those, and I know you guys are trying to kind of phase them out, but we all know that takes time. So during an 8-hour shift, just at the Leon Center as the example, those parking meters only had a 3-hour maximum. Now they've been removed, as I mentioned, but in other areas of the city that still have them, they're only a 3-hour maximum. As you've heard, if it takes you, let's give you the benefit of the doubt and say 10 to 15 minutes to get the wheelchair out of the car, get into the car, get paid, get displayed, get that done, get into your place of work or your entertainment event or whatever else you may be doing downtown, that's already taken up almost an hour of your 3-hour maximum. So now you have to trudge all the way back out there, and it's not summer here most of the time. That can be a problem. And you have to go pay another 3 hours and lose another hour. So for a 6-hour, not even an 8-hour full day, you've lost 2 full hours. As you can imagine, that doesn't make sense to a lot of people with varying abilities. And that's not the case for everyone. For me, I have right side weakness. I had 2 strokes, so I also can't use my right hand. That brings on the next issue of the parking meters, the ones where it's the pay with credit card and the machines. I have nowhere to put my wallet while I have to fish out my card. The app, while it's okay, I've had many problems with it over the years, and it doesn't always show all the spots available. I know some of the accessible spots are either blacked out or there's no accessible toggle to turn those on and off. That can also be a problem. My third point is I was just trying to think of off the top of my head numbers, and maybe you could tell me those in its entirety. If on any given day, maybe, what would you say, 30% of the parking spots downtown, like accessible spots, are used for 1 hour, maybe 2 hours max. You're talking $60 a day, multiply, works out to about $10,000 a year, give or take, let's just say, even if you want to say $15,000. Sure. I believe your budget is several hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not $1 million per year in your budget for enforcement, for fees, for all that stuff. If you raise the fee on parking enforcement, so people who shouldn't be parking in the disabled spots to begin with, and those are, let's say, $1,000 per fine, because we know it's going to happen regardless. Just putting a bigger number doesn't scare anyone, because the thought will be, oh, I just have to run in for 5 or 10 minutes. No one will know. The enforcement is there. There's your revenue. Why is that being offloaded to the people who are in a situation that cannot be changed? And as you've heard, is a very, very big concern at the best of times. Thank you.
Thank you for your points. Much appreciated. Again, we're here to hear your views on this. So I'm hearing you about the 3-hour maximum. Well, let me speak to that briefly. And that's just a very general kind of, and again, take the word general for what it's worth here. It's a general thought that we want to maintain a certain amount of movement in the parking spaces within the city in very general terms. We don't want long-term parking to happen in on-street spaces for the most part. If you do need to park for longer than 3 hours, obviously our preference and in general parking practices is to try to get you to move into either a surface lot or a garage of some sort. Now, completely understanding that those surface lots and the garages are not necessarily the best options for people with accessibility issues for where you may have to go. I get that completely. So it's always going to be a little bit of a balance here. We're proposing 3-hour limits across the city here for on-street spots. So if there's any change, if they're only 2 hours or 1 hour, whatever the case may be right now, one of the proposals out of this report is to raise it to 3 at the very least, so that we've got kind of at least an even, a level ground there of some sort. Could we contemplate a little bit more? We could, but again, it's taking into it's trying to keep them available for as many people as we possibly can throughout the course of the day. Laird may be able to better speak to the utilization rates. Laird, do you want to chime in? What are the utilization rates on our accessible parking spaces like the on-street and the surface lots that we're able to nail down right now?
Sorry, my camera's out. Hopefully you can hear me. Oh, there we go. Start my video. Perfect. Yeah, within the downtown core, utilization in the accessible runs anywhere from 10 to about 60% in any of those spaces. One of the things that we haven't factored into this report is the garages. And during the day, I would probably say 60, 70% capacity in the garages.
Thanks. Yeah, so Chown and Hanson are getting used a fair amount with those accessible spaces in there. And then like Laird said, it really depends, I think, on where the specific space is on the utilization rate and things itself. We're reasonably confident with the numbers that we did put into that report, given that there are all sorts of external pieces of the puzzle on that. But through the use of honk, through the use of the actual the coin spaces and things like that are actually at the accessible spots, and then doing a little bit of extrapolation from the pay and display meters, we're pretty confident about the revenue numbers that we did provide in that report, the $61,000 to $78,000 of parking fees a year. That seems pretty standard, and that has been steady over the last number of years. I think we went back to 2019 on that, given again COVID did cause some bumps and dips and things in the revenue. We're fairly confident with those numbers. We're getting close to the end here. Just let me make a point here about it was mentioned earlier about a parking pass for people to be able to use so that they didn't necessarily have to be paying for the meters or whatever the case may be. And yes, a couple cities actually have adopted that. I believe Guelph is one of them, so that there is a monthly fee, and it's kind of all you can eat parking that you can park in the accessible space as much as you need. You don't have to feed the meter or anything like that. You'll get issued another pass effectively to go along with your accessible placard. That is a possibility we could review. Again, it's not really within the ambit of what we're looking at this minute for this report, but happy to have more conversations about that in the future.
Great, thanks so much. Are there any other questions or comments for Curtis? Dinah?
I'm just wondering, I have had the experience of reporting or calling in and reporting a vehicle, or a couple of times a vehicle in the Rita Crest parking lot, parking in an accessible space that isn't. And the comment from the bylaw officer was that, was that it was probably just somebody visiting the home. So they put a warning on the vehicle. My question is, why isn't it an automatic fine? And can they be automatic fines? Like, I don't think a warning should ever be for parking in, like, without a placard. I think it should automatically be a fine.
So I've been here with the city of Kingston for a year now, and the direction they got from day one, there's no such thing as a warning for parking in an accessible parking space. So that is an anomaly. I can tell you that right now. They have my direction that no, this is a no discretion kind of thing. And I will say these parking fines are the most challenged through the various parking courts and things like that. So that is a concern that we do have, that we do have to deal with, is that sometimes it takes me over a year to collect on those fines. Not for the committee to be worried about, obviously, like that, but when you're getting into the $300-400 range, people see it worth their time to actually be challenging that parking ticket. So that's something that we're always cognizant about. But again, to answer your question, no warnings. Absolutely not. We actually end up probably overturning more tickets, because it may have happened that a person who actually has an accessible permit parks in the spot, we ticket them because we don't see the permit, and then through the little bit of a review process, we end up canceling the ticket. So I've got a lot of ticket cancellations for that type of parking fine, but that's just because for whatever reason you forgot your permit, it was turned over, it fell on the floor, you didn't have your visor down, whatever the case may be. So that is the direction of enforcement in the city of Kingston. No discretion whatsoever. We give you a ticket.
Okay, so it's fair enough to have words with bylaw officer if they've done that.
Yeah, that surprises me. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions at this point in time? I feel like there was a lot of information. I guess one of my questions is what is kind of the next step? And are there, I guess, if committee members do have or think of something after, is there still an opportunity to provide comments or feedback before you or before an official something goes to council? Kind of what's that next step, I guess?
You bet. No, great. Absolutely great question. If you didn't mention it, I was going to. So I'm happy to take on any concerns that you may have. Contact us is a very easy way to do it. You can get my contact information through Derek, however the may that. I'm happy to hear from that. From an official perspective, I will now have to bring a report. So it's not going to be this report. It's going to be edited and bring it into some of your comments here to one of our committees, probably the EITP, Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Committee. And that will get reviewed, and that'll be coming with, more solid, viable, whatever recommendations for them to consider. You definitely have the opportunity to speak to that committee if you have any concerns about any of the recommendations or the turn that these are particularly taking. So you'll have another very public opportunity to come as a delegation to provide comments, whatever the case may be, and that will be broadcast. I mean, that is normally identified through the thing. And Derek, we can probably make sure that the committee members know when that's going to committee in the near future. I need a bit of time to fix my report, to put in some of the suggestions that I've got here. And then ultimately that's going to go to city council. So your counselors will be involved in making the ultimate decision on what we do here. So you'll definitely have the ability to have words with your counselors, express your opinions, see what the ultimate recommendations are. And again, happy to look at it. You folks here on the committee are representing the constituency of people who need to make use of this accessible parking in the city. And we're happy to hear from you. You have the on the ground knowledge of what we need to do to make this work.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Thanks so much. So if there's no other questions, we thank you for joining us. And again, everybody, hopefully, if you haven't had a chance to look at the report, definitely take a look after this, and then you can send Curtis any kind of follow-up questions. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And so with that, we are moving very swiftly through kind of our next items. We have no motions, no notices of motion. We have no other business. We also have no other correspondence. So our next meeting, we won't meet in July or August. So our next meeting is actually September 7th at 1:00 p.m. So everybody can kind of have a little bit of time in the summer to hopefully enjoy some sunshine and things. Before we adjourn, I see Lucy has a question.
Yes, I was just wondering how, because Curtis just said that we might come and have another opportunity to voice our concerns as a group. So I was wondering if there was any way that we could discuss these issues more as a group, or if there was a time or a forum where we can come to some kind of a opinion that we can present to their group, or if it's just going to be an individual thing again.
Derek.
Hi,
Thank you.
Amy. I'm glad to take that one. So I don't believe there'll be another chance for the committee to meet before then, but there is the opportunity through the working groups that can discuss this matter. So there's the built environment and the awareness and education, but it may be more of an individual opportunity at this point. What I'll do is I'll send an email to the committee probably next week, just with some more information on this process. So if people want to continue to discuss and share information, how they can go about that.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I guess with that, so our next official meeting is the 7th of September, and we are ready to adjourn. And I do need a mover and a seconder for our adjournment this afternoon. I see Dinah and Darcy, who are kind of first hands.